Live now.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on our favorite law, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. I'm Ashley Gold, a freelance technology policy journalist who's been covering this law for a couple of years now. And with us today, we have former Congressman Chris Cox and current Senator Ron Wyden, the original authors of Section 230. If you're on this webinar, you probably know why this conversation is so relevant right now. We've never heard so much talk about Section 230 in such a mainstream way. In the past couple of years, we've now got people on both the right and left that are opposed to the law, want to see it changed, or want to see it eradicated completely. President Trump recently put out an executive order that would change the way Section 230 is enforced. And we have multiple bipartisan bills working their way through Congress that would change the law as well. As everyone recalls, the biggest change so far was Sesta Fosta a couple of years ago. And I think we're all waiting to see whether another legislative effort will actually be successful, especially in the lead up to the election. And there are a lot of misunderstandings of Section 230 and many misinterpretations. And there's a lot of talk recently about the intent of Section 230 and why the authors wrote it. So the point of today's webinar, hosted by NetChoice, is to clear up those misconceptions and really just talk to the two writers and see what was their intent. So that's enough for me. We're going to get started. And we can start with Senator Wyden. So why did you write Section 230? What problem does this law solve?
Chris and I got together, and this, of course, was the very early days, and we began to see articles. Chris will tell you about what he read on a now famous plane ride with respect to, what could happen. But we began to get inklings that if you owned a website or a blog, you could be held personally liable for what was posted on your site. And Chris and I, and people have read about this, we thought for some time people ought to really be focused on ideas. And so much of what passes for political debate now, and certainly was the case when we were thinking about Section 230, basically is just a rehash of old grievances. And I remember at one point saying to Chris, I'm getting into these new areas. I'm Oregon's first new senator in 30 years. I'm going to fight like crazy for our traditional industries like wood products. But I also want to get into technology because I saw it so promising. And I remember at one point saying to Chris, I may not know everything about the internet, but I can't conceive of why anybody would invest in a small innovator, somebody who was taking a risk and didn't have much going for them except their idea and the sweat of their brow. I didn't see why anybody would ever invest in that person if they were going to get held personally liable. And I remember asking Chris, and he said, well, guess what, Ron? They wouldn't. And so we wrote a law that we felt had a sword and a shield. The shield was to make sure that if you had that great idea, you could get it, off to the races without being tied up with lawyers forever rather than being working on your idea. And the sword was, we said, we want these new platforms to be able to go after slime and sleaze and really gross stuff. And that's how we knitted together 230, the sword and the shield.
Did you want to add to that, Congressman Cox?
Yeah, I think Ron summed it up nicely. People that don't remember the world before Section 230 don't often focus on what the legal landscape was like before. But prior to Section 230, a website, a platform, an internet portal of any kind would have a powerful incentive to not moderate content because content moderation was punished with unlimited liability. You know, the difference between what broadcast television and radio regulation had been able to focus on and the internet was just vast. It was a new challenge, and not everybody appreciated at the time the differences, and that included courts. And so some courts had decided to treat the internet as if it were television or radio. But the big difference is that with television and radio, you've got a single point of broadcast and then millions of passive users. With the internet, the equation was flipped. The users are all the broadcasters, and they're virtually unlimited. At the time, it was millions. It was clearly going to become billions, and it was borderless. Went beyond the United States. This was the World Wide Web, as everybody called it at the time. So you could see that if you made a single platform responsible for reading all of the things that these millions and billions of users created, and they would become liable for the acts of those other people unless they resisted any kind of content moderation. We knew that if you wanted the internet not to become a real swamp, that you needed to have some protection from that. And that was the purpose. So today we have protection for content moderation, and the internet still is anything but a monastery. There's a lot of bad stuff on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
But without Section 230, my God, just imagine.
Yeah, let's talk about that bad stuff a little bit. Section 230 has increasingly become a focal point for those who simply just dislike social media. Republicans often blame it for alleged bias. Democrats often blame Section 230 for hate speech and other bad content on the internet, such as terrorist material. Why do you think the conversation around Section 230 got to this particular point?
Well, I think people look, for example, at powerful, institutions, and there were powerful institutions back when we wrote Section 230. In fact, when we wrote it, there was far less competition than there is today. Basically, all consumers had was Prodigy, American Online, CompuServe, and then they were displaced by others, Yahoo and Hotmail and the like. So certainly when you see big, powerful people, what you do is you say, I'm going after them. But you shouldn't be focused on the wrong target. For example, I think the big tech companies have dramatically let the country down with respect to privacy protection. Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, I think has just blatantly lied about his privacy protection. So I'm actually offering the toughest bill with respect to cracking down on privacy ripoffs. I've said that if a CEO in the biggest companies lies and misrepresents their policies, not only would they be personally liable for those acts from a financial standpoint, but they could actually even face prison time, almost what's done with respect to the execs in financial services. So I understand the frustration with respect to big companies, and we've got to dust off the antitrust laws. And if I have a chance to do that in 2021, I'll be involved in that. But I think with respect to the big tech companies, the biggest challenge is reining in their privacy abuses. And I will tell you, my biggest concern about tech companies like Facebook, all they are interested in is selling ads. That's really what they care about, is selling ads.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that the anger against tech companies is not misguided, but somehow Section 230 has become the foil for all of this.
Well, and also, I want to hear from Chris though, but I mean, there are a lot of misunderstandings. I mean, despite all the rhetoric, Section 230 does not provide a shield for activities on platforms that violate federal law. We hear all that all the time. We always hear, Chris and I, if we had a nickel for every time we were told that we wrote a law that required neutrality, we would be able to I would be able to take care of my kids' education. I mean, that would be easy. And the point really is, there's not a word in Section 230 that Chris Cox and I developed that talks about neutrality. In fact, quite the opposite. We said they're going to be conservative websites. They can focus on people who care about that. They're going to be liberal websites. Let's let them focus on what they're interested in. And guess what? The authors of the bill said that's what we want because the marketplace, rather than government, would decide where people went.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Congressman Cox, do you have anything to add to that, especially on the neutrality point, which often does get confused?
Yeah, I think that's, as you could see, an interesting point of intersection between a Republican and a Democrat. You know, the question of content moderation is, of course, a very important one and a subjective one and a difficult one. And the question of who's going to be making those decisions is at its center. Ron and I agree that the harm in having the government decide these speech questions would be much greater than allowing private ordering, because with private ordering, you have a chance for a divergence of viewpoints, and you avoid the risk that, you know, political control, as we have seen at the extreme in China and to nearly that extent in Russia, you know, could take place. We don't want to have speech police run by the government. Instead, we want users, the fundamental, you know, working of the internet, to be able to express themselves. That's the difference, as I was saying before, between the internet and the means of communication that came before it. So if user-generated content in real time, by the way, is the object on a global basis, then putting a government front runner in the way so that the government is going to say this and not that, you know, is just absolutely antithetical to it. By the way, that was the regulatory idea of Senator James Exxon. And so his, you know, Senate version of the Communications Decency Act that he appended to the telecommunications bill back then, the same bill that Ron and I amended in the House with our you know, separate freestanding bill. That was a federal regulatory model where the federal government would become the speech police, and it's just not going to work. So I think the second point Ron made is worth noting, and that is that there's a not so much among the legal community, but on television, about how Section 230 operates, that it is some sort of, you know, special shield or special privilege, or that it somehow protects illegality, and that sites can, you know, do illegal things with impunity. To the contrary, you know, all of the crimes that one can commit are, you know, punishable just as before. And furthermore, if the platform is even partly involved in creating the content or just developing it, as, for example, Backpage was, then they themselves are not entitled to the protections of Section 230. And the law is clearly written that way. A few courts have gotten it wrong, but that's a huge, important point to recognize. And federal criminal law, by the way, is just totally exempted from any touch of Section 230. State criminal law is completely enforceable to the extent it's consistent with 230.
And Ashley, one other point with respect to this question of targeting the tech companies and whether we think somehow this is misplaced. I think there really has been something of a conflation between First Amendment complaints with regard to hate speech and Section 230 complaints. And a lot of the complaints about tech companies are really about the First Amendment and not about Section 230. And my favorite example of this is the New York Times actually wrote an article in which Chris and I both were standing there at a podium and the like. And they actually wrote a correction that said, one of their articles, and I'll quote here, misidentified the law that protects hate speech. It is the First Amendment, not Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. That is a New York Times correction in a long article about 230, where your two guests were standing next to each other, because what we would usually do is go to these meetings and we would say things along these lines, and then we'd go look for a place to get an ice cream cone.
I want to ask you about the First Amendment a little more. I mean, especially lately, a lot of the complaints we hear about Section 230 are indeed First Amendment complaints, even complaints by the president. How does this conflation happen? And what is the simplest way you explain to someone that, you know, you're arguing about the wrong thing? How do you really combat that information in that argument when it's proliferated so much, especially as high as the president?
Well, the president wants to do it because he finds it, you know, beneficial. He wants to force Twitter to print his lies. For example, he wants to lie about vote by mail. And I'm the nation's first senator elected completely by mail. He's always talking about how there's fraud. And Dennis Richardson, our late Secretary of State, a Republican, very conservative, actually wrote Donald Trump and said, hey, you know, we don't have any fraud. And he did that before, you know, before he passed. But the fact is, the First Amendment and Section 230 are very different. The First Amendment says that government can't tell private individuals what they can or can't say in most cases. That includes hate speech, political speech you don't like, religious speech, and among other things. And as I said, and Chris and I have been talking about, Section 230 is very different. Section 230 gives to platforms the ability to moderate the slime and the gross stuff and the like. So there's a lot of misinformation, you know, out there, a lot of conflation between the First Amendment and Section 230. But people who ought to know better, who claim to be constitutional scholars, are blaming a law about third-party liability online for the First Amendment to the Constitution, and they are just two different things.
I want to ask you about the Earn It Act. It's going to get marked up either this week or next week. And to me, this looks like the most bipartisan proposal that's come out since Sesta Fosta that may have a chance to pass. What do you think of the Earn It Act, both of you? And politically, what do you think of its chances of passing the way Sesta Fosta was able to pass?
Well, let's let Chris start and then I'll come back.
Well, I'm happy to start on the substance, but I think on the political question, Ron, you're better situated to ask. I'm out here in California and you're right there in the Capitol.
Well, I mean, I will tell you, number one, I think my colleagues are seeing that Sesta Fosta was a disaster. I mean, we have seen in a lot of, you know, areas that the problem has gotten greater, that we've seen sites disappear, sites that don't even have the word sex trafficking in it. And basically all it's done is drive the slime and these horrible monsters that are involved in sex trafficking to the dark web. So I've made it really clear what I think of the Earn It Act. I think it's two things. I think it's a big speech police, and I'm just stunned that all these conservative Republicans, you know, for years, you know, condemned, you know, government's role in speech, now want to set up some big government speech police and basically put Bill Barr in charge of it because he'd have kind of the last word in it. And then it also contains a really misguided proposal to weaken strong encryption. It's practically like a big bonus to pedophiles because, you know, this is going to make it tougher for parents to protect their kids. So I am all in this fight. And I think Republicans are going to be scratching their head at the opposition to weakening strong encryption if they go on this, because they'll have signed on to something that's going to have people being less safe. And my Democratic colleagues, they're going to empower Bill Barr? I don't think so.
So yeah, to that, I would add a couple substantive points about the way the legislative language is actually drafted. I understand the idea. I know what they're trying to get at. I think that the vehicle that they've chosen is problematic. So at its center, it's got a commission that's going to have a bunch of political appointees on it. And this commission is going to operate very differently than any other kind of rulemaking body in the administrative state. So there are two kinds of commissions that we usually see. We see either rules that are adopted through the Administrative Procedure Act process, and that automatically makes them open to public comment. There's notice, it's transparent, we can see what they're doing in the public, which consists of a lot of people who know a lot of things about, for example, how the internet works, how disinformation works, what the problems are, what the solutions are, how AI works, how algorithms work, and so on. We ought to get the benefit of that, but we won't, because this commission in the Earn It Act doesn't have any kind of participatory public input. The other kind that we often see are, federal advisory commissions that advise the executive. And the president here has been noted as an executive order that he's issued on this subject. The White House has a special office now focused on this question. And so, this could be a federal advisory committee, but if it were a normal one, it would be created under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which also provides for transparency and for public input and participation. So by depriving the process of coming up with what they're calling internet best practices, content moderation best practices, of that kind of public input, this is going to be, if you will, a dumbed down, a stupid version of what could be the best result if it had more inputs. Adding to the problematic nature of the way this is constructed, even after they go through the process of sifting through evidence and coming up with best practices with this politically appointed commission, the Attorney General, if he has a better idea, can just override all that and do it herself. So the system it's worse than Rube Goldberg. It's designed to freeze out the public, and I think to freeze out intelligence in coming up with the best rules.
And Ashley, just freeze that last sentence of Chris Cox's very thoughtful, substantive, non-political comment about what a mess this thing is. And that is, at the end of this big purported effort to gather input and promote best practices and the like, Bill Barr can say, that's not really what I want to do. And, Bill Barr is basically, as far as I can tell, one of the lead authors of this ridiculous executive order on 230, which is actually even worse than the Earn It bill. And that takes some doing because the Earn It bill is so bad.
So there's one other substantive point, actually, that's worth making here. And that is that I said at the outset, I understand what they're trying to accomplish and I sympathize with their objectives. Because, Ron and I and everybody who voted for Section 230 back a quarter century ago, wants to make sure our criminal laws are enforced, that all of our laws, civil laws as well, defamation and so on, that they're all enforced to the max. It's just a question of, how it works on the internet and whether it works. One of the great objectives, I think, that the sponsors of the Earn It Act have is to protect children from child exploitation. And there is mandatory reporting in this bill to what's called NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Coupled with the government, functional mandate of reporting and following these best practices in order to get the current law benefit of immunity, you're going to create a situation where the reporting to NCMEC is no longer voluntary, but it is going to be viewed by courts as mandated by the Earn It Act. The consequence of that is that the state-private distinction that Ron alluded to a moment ago in the First Amendment context is going to create Fourth Amendment problems for us. And now this is going to be, government-sponsored content moderation and reporting. And the question is that an intrusion under the Fourth Amendment? And it might result in the suppression of all of the evidence that's turned over to NCMEC, because criminal defendants now will have, a get out of jail free card. That would be a disastrous result. And that's another unintended consequence of this not very effective construct that's at the center of the Internet Act, which is this cockamamie commission.
Ashley, apropos of that, I want to kind of highlight the choice between doing something that is effective and targeted, or something that just sounds like it's going to be good, but is really just an effort to promote Donald Trump's culture war. I introduced a bill to dramatically expand the prosecutors and the investigators and the child welfare specialists to really deal with this obscene exploitation of children. And actually, I proposed as part of the Sesta-Fosta bill, I said, do y'all want to do something effective, or do you just want to drive these people to the dark web? And I actually proposed more prosecutors and investigators there as well. So I don't take a backseat to anybody in terms of fighting child exploitation and these grotesque images and the like on the web. But the way to do it is through my legislation, which significantly expands prosecutors, investigators, and child welfare specialists to go after those who would exploit our children, rather than something meaningless like the Earn It Act.
Right, right. I want to talk a little bit more about the Justice Department and Bill Barr. He's argued a couple of times in the past year or two that Section 230 was written without today's internet in mind, was written for an internet with a lot fewer websites and a lot less people using the internet every day for e-commerce, communication, everything else, and that it simply needs to be updated to better reflect today's digital age. Do you agree with this at all? Were you thinking about the future when you wrote this? And do you agree with this idea that we simply live in a different world now and therefore the rules have to be different?
Ron, do you mind if I jump in on this one?
I'd like that.
This one drives me nuts because I think that people are so accustomed to looking askance at Congress and all the lobbyists that crawl around Capitol Hill and all the money in politics and so on, that they just assume that every piece of legislation was a special favor for some group that sent a swarm of lobbyists to the Hill and bought and paid for some legislators and got it done. The great difference between writing this particular piece of legislation and almost any other one that I was involved in is that Ron and I were so far ahead of the curve that there was nobody lobbying on it. No kidding. I mean, back then, AOL was just getting started and they never even showed up to talk to us about this. And likewise, CompuServe and Prodigy, never heard from them, even though a case involving Prodigy was, what stimulated my interest in this. I read about it in the newspaper. When I read about the newspaper, I immediately reported to Ron. I said, remember that lunch we had? Here's something that kind of fits the description of the kind of issue we were looking at, where it's brand new issue. Democrats and Republicans don't have a knee-jerk response to this because it's a new challenge. Why don't we, sink our teeth into this and see if we can fix the problem and then build a bipartisan coalition? And that's what we did. It was absolutely free of lobbying pressure from anybody. And second, once we got around to fastening on what the problem and the solution were, here's how we identified it. We saw the problem as being the convergence of the many, the millions of users on the one platform, and the unreasonableness of a legal standard that would require the one platform to actually anticipatorily review all of the content created by these millions of people. This is supposed to be real-time communication. It's supposed to be, user generated, and it's supposed to be global. And none of that can happen in real time if the platform, has to be an editor or a publisher and sift through all of it first and be responsible for it. So we came up with this idea of Section 230 to make sure that they could at least moderate whatever content they could without penalty, but that the people who actually created the content and the subset of them who did something wrong would be responsible for whatever they did wrong and not the platform.
And do you think that you were thinking about the internet of the future when you were doing this? Did you think
so actually,
it would need to be updated?
Right, to that point. So we knew even back in the 90s that the internet was going to be growing, and that this problem of millions of people converging on one platform was going to be even a bigger problem as millions became billions, because it was manifestly global. It was called the World Wide Web even back then, and the technology clearly permitted it. So with each passing year, the need for something like Section 230 would be greater and greater and greater. But now fast forward 25 years, when people want to come in and revise history, and they say, well, the real reason that 230 was enacted was to protect an infant industry. It was nurtured in its cradle. It might have, died, preliminarily without the support of government. And that argument is made with some infant industries, and it happens to be true in other historical cases. Not here. We never had the idea that this was an infant industry that needed protection. We had in mind that there was this special problem that was built into the technology that was only going to get worse with time. And we could clearly see, and we now know for sure with the long lens of history, that the billions of people globally using the internet, versus a single platform, that problem absolutely, cries out for, 230. Without it, user-generated content really couldn't exist in a plausible way on the internet.
Ashley, I'm going to have to get out the door in a second, but Chris just gave you a tour de force for why we thought that our proposal made sense then, and we still think it stands the test of time. And I just want to kind of, as I give a quick summation, I always get asked, so Ron, what changes do you think are necessary to Section 230 because of just what you talked about? Is people are confused between the First Amendment and Section 230, and they have this idea that Donald Trump and others, Bill Barr, talked to him about neutrality, which the bill never mentions. And when I get asked about what changes to Section 230 I would find acceptable, I want to flip this around. And that is, I think it's important to make sure that any changes in the law we wrote do not target constitutionally protected speech. I think that's number one. And I think it is important that anything done not in any way discourage moderation by internet services. And I will tell you, every single proposal on Section 230 now on offer violates one or both of these principles. So I understand what's going on out there, and I'm basically running around trying to catch all these phony theories with a net and then respond to them and come back and tackle other challenges. And I know that this is going to be a tough fight. But those who want to in some way throw out Section 230, I want to hear what they're going to do to protect constitutionally protected speech. And I want to hear what they're going to do to promote moderation by internet services, because thus far, everything that's offered violates those kinds of ideas. And in the parlance of the Senate, Chris and I were both a couple of young House guys, and then he moved on to the executive branch and I came to the Senate. I'm going to yield the rest of any time I have to my friend and co-author. It has been an extraordinary ride. I thought that the bill would be important. I told this to Chris for the reasons that we've been talking about. I'm not sure I would have ever thought, and maybe Chris imagined it, there'd be a book that said the 26 words that created the internet, and there'd be a chapter that said Chris and Ron had lunch. I never imagined anything quite like that. But thank you for the chance to lay out my take on this, and you've really made my day as well to get a chance to catch up with my old friend Chris Cox. Okay, to be continued. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Wyden. Appreciate it. This leads into my next question for you, Representative Cox. Many people have said that Section 230 is judge-made law and that it has gone as far as it has today because of the way that judges have interpreted it and dismissed lawsuits under it. What do you think of this? Do you agree at all that judges have interpreted it in a way that it's gone further than it was originally intended?
So, since the law was enacted a quarter century ago, there has developed a literal, or actually a figurative, mountain of case law. It's been quite an avocation just to follow the case law over the last few decades. So not surprisingly, there have been some outlier decisions. Many of the criticisms that are popularized about Section 230, focus on these outlier cases. I think there are anomalies.
Can you tell us about some of those outlier cases specifically?
Yeah, sure, I'll mention a few, but the point to put context around it that's important first to make is that for the most part, the courts have gotten it right. The statute is fairly easy to read. One hazard of judicial decision making is that over time, court opinions like to cite other court opinions more than they like to cite the statute. And so once something a little bit at odds with the statute makes it into case law, it might get repeated without referring back to the statute. So a couple of things that I think viewers of this webcast might be familiar with that I think are anomalous and wrong are the way the First Circuit and the district court in Massachusetts within the First Circuit handled the Backpage litigation, Jane Doe versus Backpage, because the Senate had done a great deal of investigation and published a report that showed in Technicolor that Backpage was actually helping people write their ads. They hired people to do it. They would take words that were slang for underage and so on, which would show criminality, and they would change it to something else. So that showed knowledge on their part, but more important, that showed participation. The way Section 230 is written, in particular in subsection F3, it makes it very clear that if you're participating in the development of content, then you yourself are a content creator. And another court, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, in a case called roommates.com, which was an en banc decision of that court, meaning it was the most prestigious authoritative way that the Ninth Circuit can speak, got it right. And they made it clear that participating even in the design of your website in ways that elicit certain kinds of possibly illegal user-generated content, makes you a content creator, and therefore you are no longer eligible for this kind of immunity. So I'm sorry that Backpage attracted so much attention because I think the court got it wrong. And particularly after the plaintiffs went back and redrafted their complaint to include a lot of specificity about, how Backpage was itself a content creator. It turned out not to matter because, Backpage, eventually was gotten by the feds. And it's worth also noting that, federal criminal enforcement is completely, outside of 230 and not inhibited by that in any way. The problem with Backpage is that until very, very late in the game, the federal government never bothered to prosecute them. And I don't think there was much excuse for that. So, that's one of the cases that I think, deserves some criticism. Another one was an early Ninth Circuit case back from about 2007. And in that case, it was called the Batzel case. That involved a one-man website. One person had his own website, and he got an email privately on his own email, not online, not user-generated content and so on. He thought this email was interesting, and he decided to post it on his own website. And he edited it, he changed it. So for all these varieties of reasons, he's way outside Section 230, and yet even though what he posted was defamatory, and somebody then came and sued him for republishing libel, what the court said is that mere editing is not enough, but mere editing in that situation should have been plenty enough under F3 of 230 to take him outside of the protection of the statute, and that immunity should not have been granted. So, those are examples of outlier cases. I think the Ninth Circuit in the roommates case, as a matter of fact, that I mentioned, has sort of distinguished Batzel away, but it hasn't been overruled. It's still out there.
Let's talk about this executive order from President Trump for a little bit. What do you think is the real purpose of putting forward something like this?
Well, I know something about executive orders. When I worked in the White House counsel's office, one of my remits was drafting executive orders, and I drafted several. And I have, a perspective of, the executive branch and the presidency on what the president can do with an executive order. I have a pretty broad view of it. An executive order as a form is a presidential command. It has to be given to people who work for the president in order to have effect. But if the president, says, go get me lunch, and it's not published in the Federal Register, that's still legally an executive order, and the federal employee is bound to do it. So there's a lot that you can do with executive orders, but there's one thing you cannot do with an executive order, and that's repeal an existing federal law. Portions of the executive order purport to change what's written in Section 230. That's entirely within the province of the Justice Department to propose to Congress, and for the president to propose to Congress. And the Justice Department is going to be doing that soon, and they have legislation that's currently pending at OMB that we'll shortly see, I expect. But the EO overreaches, and it reinterprets Section 230 in ways that are facially inconsistent with the statute. So you have to go to Congress and ask them to change it if you want to do those things.
I want to talk to you about liability protections in the US compared to the rest of the world. How much do you think Section 230 has played into internet giants like Facebook, Google, Amazon, Twitter, Reddit, eBay really thriving and being used all over the world compared to countries that have different types of liability regimes, and how much of that can be attributed to 230?
Well, as Ron was saying, some people have wanted to give enormous credit to this legislation for enabling the internet as we know it, which is built on a lot of user-generated content. I don't know how often you do it, but I find myself, using YouTube how-to videos all the time, to fix the garbage disposal or whatever the heck it is. I am so grateful to all these people who find the time not only to ingeniously come up with, recipes or, fixes for things in your home or garden or your car, or even things on your job. And then not only do that, but then they take the time to professionally video it and put it up on YouTube and make it so simple. So, thank God for that stuff. And that's all obviously enabled by Section 230 and wouldn't be on anybody's platform without it. But I like to think of the international aspect of this, because if one looks right now to the People's Republic of China and the closed off system that they've created, you can't access any of what was supposed to be the World Wide Web that's of meaningful political import in China, because they don't want you to see it and they control it. If you control what people say to each other, if you punish people for what's in their emails, and I think the social credit system in China is aimed to do that, you've got a very different, I would say totalitarian world. And we've got in our system, 1,000 flowers blooming and people can say whatever they want without the government being the arbiter, no speech police. We have private sector moderators, and that's, become a challenge, and it has its own issues. But we are clearly on the right side of this big divide of whether people are going to have the right to express themselves and to read what others write or not, and the rest of the world not so much. So, this goes into the question that came up in a congressional hearing this morning about whether Section 230 belongs in trade agreements. I think it does. I think we should promote freedom, and when we have some leverage with China, for example, in trade, we ought to press our advantage.
If proposals by lawmakers such as Senator Hawley become successful, how do smaller companies deal with that, knowing all the litigation they may be dealing with if a law like that passed? And do any of these proposals allow for a world in which a website that relies on user-generated content can actually exist?
Well, this gets us back to the fundamental question that Ron and I were addressing 25 years ago. And that is, how does the internet function if it's millions of content generators in a single platform, if the single platform is responsible from the get-go in real time for all of that, for all of that user-generated content. I just gesticulated and knocked my laptop away. So this problem, having grown greater with the multiplicity of users over time, is the challenge for, Senator Hawley and others who are trying to draft, new responsibilities for platforms without, flipping the responsibility, in the opposite way. So everybody claims to want to preserve the benefits of 230 while they're doing these things. So we have to ask ourselves, what happens if you have a new subjective standard, not a test as in 230 of did you create the content or not? Did you participate in creating it or not? Something that can easily be put into a legal complaint, into a pleading, and a judge can decide, upfront on the pleadings, did they meet the test or not? But a subjective test that requires a lawsuit to proceed beyond a motion to dismiss, beyond summary judgment, into discovery, which can last for years, because it's a fact question of who knew what or who should have known something. What kinds of procedures did they have in place, and was it reasonable, and did they exercise a duty of care, and all that sort of thing. These are subjective questions. What it means is that every single case is going to turn into, a big potential liability and a candidate for settlement. If the average case in the federal system and on the civil side right now is 7 years to settlement, then the settlement value in years 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 is, some discounted value of, what it would cost you to maintain your defense for the full 7 years. Being able to gin up settlement value just by filing a complaint and getting past summary judgment is going to be such a burden for websites that they're going to say, I'm not going to take this on with respect to potentially every piece of content. When it wouldn't be every, but hundreds of people could do this to me. I'm not going to do that. And so I have to, second guess myself about my use of user-generated content. I think will kill our comment section on my e-commerce site or whatever it is. It would work vast changes in the way the internet operates.
Many have speculated that Section 230 is bound to be substantially amended at some point in the near future. Jeff Kosseff, who's the author of that Section 230 book we were talking about, has said that. Do you agree that changes are inevitable?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, you should rely on Ron more than on me for this question, because I'm out here in California and I'm stuck watching television and reading newspapers and the internet and so on. And everything I get is second and third hand about what the Capitol is going to do. But I will say this, based on my experience, after Exxon passed his horrible Communications Decency Act, it passed almost unanimously in the Senate. And it was popular because it was anti-pornography, and, being in favor of pornography, and not protecting children is a pretty damn unpopular position. So not surprisingly, once the issue got framed as that, everybody decided they had to be on the side of the angels, and no discussion of, what was going to happen with, speech issues or privacy issues or constitutional questions or what have you was really relevant after that. And so when it came to the House, it was presumed that the House would do the same thing. The world's greatest deliberative body had spoken, and the House, has an election every 2 years. And so we had to do exactly the same thing. But Ron and I, spent a lot of time, whole year, educating our colleagues about what the issues were and so on. And we completely reversed the conventional wisdom. So I have great faith that might again happen here as people look more soberly at whether there might be a mismatch between problem and solution with some of the solutions they're coming up with. The problems are real, I don't deny that.
Yeah.
But it's a question about, what's an effective fix, what's really going to work, and what's going to potentially have a lot of unintended consequences and make things even worse than they are now.
And in your experience in Washington, Is it at all unusual to you to see Attorney General Barr's level of interest and involvement in this particular topic? How unprecedented or strange is that to you based on your experience in Washington?
Oh no, I think AGs proposing legislation on salient topics of the day is quite appropriate and quite normal. And AGs have always had their favorite things. I mean, when Ed Meese was Attorney General, he had a big anti-pornography campaign, if you may recall, that maybe gave some fuel to what Senator Exxon did. I'm not sure, but that was a decade later. But AGs always have their pet issues, and this one. It's not just the Department of Justice that's noticed this. I mean, everybody in Congress on both the Republican House side, and it's front page above the fold in major national newspapers on a routine basis. So no surprise.
Mm-hmm. Looking ahead to a potential Biden presidency, is there more or less of a chance of substantial changes to 230 coming? And if you want to maybe not talk about the politics so much, what are you predicting about how the debate might change and may shift from what we hear most commonly now, which is bias, to things that maybe Democrats care more about?
Yeah, I think Democrats and Republicans have slightly different reasons for wanting to be critical of social media companies and platforms, but they converge on the fact that they're the bad guys. So that won't change, regardless of who the next president is. But yes, I think you're right that the line of attack may change, and we'll see. The platforms themselves have a great deal of control over how bad they get beaten about the head and ears, because they can make changes themselves preemptively, and they can listen to what people are clamoring for, and if they find a way to do it that is consistent with keeping the internet vibrant and not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, then we'd all be pleased. But when people have legitimate concern that criminal laws might not be being enforced, or criminality is being people are turning a blind eye to it or whatever, there are a lot of websites, there are a lot of platforms, not all about the big ones. The complaints run the gamut. And I mentioned Backpage earlier as one example, and the dark web is, as Ron was saying, loaded with all this stuff. So if platforms, responsible ones, step up and do things, and I would put into that bucket things such as being more transparent about their moderation policies and making those moderation policies more explicit, and providing more public feedback about how the rules are uniformly being enforced, why they're being enforced, taking some of the mystery out of it. Even explaining, perhaps more how the algorithms work and why it's not all mindless, and why human beings are ultimately, trusted human beings are behind this. I think it might take some of the steam out, and more importantly, it'll take the steam out because it might fix some of the problems.
Mm-hmm. I was going to mention the algorithms, and sometimes there's talk about if the algorithms are the reason why you're seeing certain things pop up on your feed, then that's the company participating in what you see, and there's been some conflation there. And I think those calls for transparency are just going to keep coming. I think so often people just feel caught by surprise or singled out by platforms' rules as they are constantly changing. I just want to ask you, we've only got a little bit of time left. Is there anything you would have done differently about drafting 230 if you could go back? Is there anything you could change, you would want to change?
Well, sure. I mean, the easiest thing to do, having read the 25 years worth of case law, would be to find all the places where I thought the courts got it wrong and add about 3 paragraphs to the statute to make sure that they couldn't make that mistake. But I don't think that 230 is actually, ambiguously or cryptically drafted. I do think that there has been some, willful attempt to, make the statute work in the way that the court thinks it needs to work. And the aversion to subsection F3 and the fact that a platform can be a content creator by, participating just in part in the development, not even the creation of content, I think is probably the biggest biggest area. Another one is the otherwise objectionable language in the statute. There are rules of statutory construction that apply generally that say that when you have a series of terms that are mostly alike and then a catch-all at the end, that the catch-all, is an expansion of the series. So it's sort of like an SAT question about, what doesn't belong in this collection, in this set. And that places a natural limit on content moderation for any purpose whatsoever. And it should be a tool to get after some of these complaints that people have about naked bias or what have you. A website that is devoted, if the DNC or the RNC have websites, they ought to be able to have points of view in their user-generated content and so on. And that's not a problem. So we don't need websites to be neutral, but we need websites to neutrally enforce their terms of service and their moderation policies. So in addition to reading the statute properly, I would say that I'd like to see a lot more enforcement of state consumer protection laws, what we sometimes refer to as the mini FTC laws, and the federal FTC Act to hold platforms liable and accountable for the advertising claims they make about their moderation policies. That would be a nice way to get, bad actors who promise one thing and do another to clean up their acts.
And that's totally independent of Section 230.
Yes, I actually heard somebody in this morning's congressional hearing, one of the witnesses, say that in state enforcement of their consumer protection laws and their FTC acts would be preempted by 230. That's absolutely not right. Section 230 has to do with treating a platform as the publisher of content created by another, but holding a platform responsible for its advertising or false advertising has nothing to do with that. Neither does holding them responsible for their terms of service, which is a contract with their users.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I'm sure as we get closer to the election and we have plenty of political advertising, this debate will just keep raging on, and it will be very interesting to see if Earn It or another Section 230 proposal has any chance to succeed in the lead up to the election, or if anything will survive into the next presidency. And with that, we're about at our time. I want to thank you so much for joining us today and clearing up some of these misconceptions that we hear so often on social media, on TV, and everywhere else. And thank you for participating. And I hope everyone learned something today.
Great to see you, Ashley, and great to see my friend Ron.
Great. Thank you so much.